Nobody puts it in the recruitment poster. Nobody talks about it at the ceremony when the medals come home. But every single person who has ever worn a uniform and spent time in a combat zone has dealt with it, thought about it, worried about it, and in many cases has a story about it that they will tell until their dying day. Going to the bathroom during war is one of those universal human experiences that cuts straight through the mythology of combat and reminds everyone, officers and enlisted alike, that the human body does not care about your tactical situation. It needs what it needs, when it needs it. For most of American military history, the problem was staggering in scale. An army is not just a fighting force. It is a city on the move, and cities produce an enormous amount of human waste. During the Civil War, Union and Confederate camps alike were often located near water sources, and those same water sources quickly became contaminated with waste from tens of thousands of men living in close quarters with no sanitation infrastructure whatsoever. Dysentery, typhoid, and cholera tore through armies with a ferocity that musket balls simply couldn't match. More soldiers died from disease in that war than from combat, and a significant portion of that disease traced directly back to the catastrophic sanitation conditions of camp life. The military had not yet worked out even the most basic hygiene protocols, and men were dying for it. Regulations existed on paper. Sinks, which was the military's period term for latrines, were supposed to be dug at specified distances from camp, away from water, covered regularly with fresh soil. In practice, discipline broke down constantly. Soldiers, tired and cold and in no mood to walk a quarter-mile in the dark, relieved themselves wherever they happened to be standing. Officers who tried to enforce sanitation rules quickly discovered that you can make a man march 20 miles, but you cannot always make him walk to the designated latrine at 2 in the morning. By the time of the First World War, the military understood the connection between sanitation and combat effectiveness in a way it simply hadn't a generation earlier. Trench warfare created its own unique and almost indescribable nightmare when it came to basic human needs. The trenches on the Western Front stretched for hundreds of miles, and the men in them couldn't just step outside for a walk. Snipers watched every inch of open ground. Moving around during daylight was an invitation to die. Nighttime offered some relief, but even in darkness, shelling never fully stopped, and no man wanted to be caught out in the open when a barrage came down. The answer, such as it was, involved small cut-down oil cans, empty ammunition boxes, or simple holes cut in the wooden boards of the trench floor. Privacy was non-existent. A soldier who needed to relieve himself did so in full view of his unit, sometimes within arm's reach of men eating or sleeping. The contents of those improvised receptacles had to be disposed of somehow, and at night, men would haul them up over the parapet and dump them into no man's land, which slowly accumulated a layer of human waste on top of everything else already there: mud, wire, shell craters, and the dead. The smell of the First World War trenches has been described by survivors in terms that defy easy quotation, but the combination of human waste, rotting flesh, mud, and cordite smoke created an odor that men who survived the war said they could conjure again instantly, 60 years later, simply by closing their eyes. Intestinal illness in the trenches was endemic. Men ate food prepared under impossible conditions, drank water that was often barely treated, and lived in an environment of constant contamination. Trench foot gets most of the historical attention, but the intestinal diseases that tore through units on both sides were a constant drain on combat effectiveness. A man who cannot hold down food or water is not a man who can fight effectively, and countless soldiers spent days or weeks in rear area hospitals simply because the sanitation situation in their section of trench had been catastrophic. The Second World War brought the American military into environments so varied that no single sanitation solution could possibly work for all of them. In the Pacific, jungle conditions created problems unlike anything the Army had previously encountered. The heat, the humidity, the insects, and the dense vegetation combined to create an environment where disease could spread at a pace that shocked even experienced medical officers. Malaria was the famous killer, but dysentery and other intestinal diseases ran it a very close second. In some campaigns, more men were evacuated for disease than for combat wounds. Standard practice in fixed positions called for the slit trench latrine, exactly what it sounds like. A narrow trench about 4 feet deep, wide enough for a man to crouch over, ideally covered with a simple wooden frame for stability. Quicklime or soil was supposed to be added after each use to reduce odor and manage decomposition. In the jungle, managing these latrines was a constant battle against nature itself. The tropics decomposed organic matter with astonishing speed, which was both useful and dangerous, since the same warmth and moisture that accelerated breakdown also bred insects in numbers that could not easily be described. On the move, which was the condition of infantry most of the time, formal latrines simply didn't exist. You found a spot away from the main body of the unit, downwind and downhill if possible, did what you had to do, and covered it. That was the entire protocol. The Army issued small entrenching tools precisely because digging was such a constant part of infantry life, and sanitation was one of the less discussed reasons you always had a shovel within reach. But combat changes everything, and that is where the already limited dignity of field sanitation completely vanished. When you are under fire, when enemy soldiers are within range, and your sergeant is screaming for suppression, and the man to your left has just been hit, the idea of finding a private moment to attend to personal needs becomes almost absurd. Yet the body does not negotiate with bullets. Veterans of the island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific, of the grinding hedgerow fighting in Normandy, of the frozen misery of the Chosan Reservoir in Korea, all have told versions of the same story. There are moments in combat when you simply go where you are, in whatever position you happen to be in, and you deal with it later. Marines who fought at Iwo Jima described lying for hours in volcanic sand under withering fire, unable to move, unable to speak above a whisper, unable to do anything except keep their heads down and hope the next shell didn't have their name on it. Bodily functions happened. Uniforms were soiled. Nobody mentioned it then, and few mentioned it afterward. It was simply part of what combat was, part of the absolute stripping away of everything that civilian life considered normal. A man who has spent 3 days in a foxhole knows things about human endurance that cannot be learned any other way. American soldiers in Korea were issued rations that, while improved over World War II, were still the subject of constant and heartfelt complaint. C rations, as they were called, were canned meals designed for portability rather than palatability or digestive ease. Soldiers who ate nothing but C rations for extended periods became intimately familiar with the gastrointestinal consequences. Constipation, alternating without warning with the opposite problem, was a fact of life that mess sergeants and battalion surgeons dealt with as a chronic condition across entire units. Vietnam brought American soldiers into a combat environment that was in some ways the most sanitation hostile of any war in American history. The jungle was everywhere and absolutely impenetrable to outside view, which solved the privacy problem in the most radical way imaginable. A man could step 6 feet off a trail and be effectively invisible. But the same jungle that offered visual cover was teeming with parasites, insects, and pathogens that found the human digestive system an inviting destination. Intestinal parasites were common to the point of being nearly universal among soldiers who served extended periods in the field. Some infections went undetected for months or years after men returned home, only showing up later when someone finally figured out why they couldn't stay healthy. In the bush, on patrol, or during extended operations away from fixed positions, Vietnam soldiers dealt with sanitation the same way soldiers always have in the field. By finding a spot, handling it quickly, and moving on. But the tactical situation in Vietnam added a specific layer of urgency. The enemy was often invisible. Attack could come from any direction without warning, and the noise and distraction of relieving oneself were the exact conditions in which an ambush could be initiated. Veterans describe a particular kind of hypervigilance that became automatic, a constant scanning of the surrounding jungle even in moments of maximum personal vulnerability, a situational awareness that never fully switched off regardless of what else was happening. The military issued certain items that made field hygiene marginally more manageable. Toilet paper was part of the standard combat load, though it frequently ran out before resupply arrived, and soldiers learned to improvise with whatever was available, which, in a jungle environment, turns out to be a remarkably wide range of plant material, some of which is considerably better suited to the purpose than others. A soldier who grabbed the wrong plant in haste learned a lesson about tropical botany that no field manual had bothered to cover. The Army does not, as a general rule, prepare its people for every possible scenario. The Gulf War of 1991 introduced a new generation of American soldiers to desert conditions, which presented a completely different set of sanitation challenges. Desert environments have almost no natural cover. A man walking away from his vehicle in the Saudi desert might as well be standing on a stage, visible for miles in every direction. Units developed protocols involving small folding entrenching tools and brief, coordinated moments when the entire group faced outward in a security posture while individual members dealt with personal needs one at a time. The ritual was practiced, timed, and treated with the same military precision as any other operational task. Because in that environment, leaving the unit exposed and inattentive even for a few minutes was a genuine tactical vulnerability. Dehydration in the desert affects the digestive system profoundly, and soldiers in the Gulf were constantly struggling to maintain adequate hydration. The military pushed fluids aggressively precisely because dehydration was recognized as a combat effectiveness issue. Dehydrated soldiers make poor decisions, fatigue more quickly, and lose situational awareness. So, maintaining fluid intake was treated as a tactical priority. The trade-off was that constant fluid intake in the absence of adequate food and electrolyte balance created its own intestinal complications that the unit surgeon dealt with on a daily basis. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, running across more than 2 decades and involving hundreds of thousands of American service members, generated a body of sanitation experience so vast and varied that entire books could be written on the subject alone. On major bases, facilities evolved over time into something approaching recognizable infrastructure. The first improvised latrines of the early invasion period gave way to portable toilets, which gave way eventually to full plumbing in some larger installations, a development that soldiers described with an almost reverent appreciation for what civilians take entirely for granted. But outside the wire, on patrol, at remote outposts, or during extended dismounted operations, the situation was far more primal. The terrain of Afghanistan in particular, all rock and dirt and vegetation that offered varying degrees of cover depending on the valley you happened to be in, meant that sanitation varied wildly from one location to the next. In some forward operating bases, facilities were carefully constructed and maintained. At smaller patrol bases and combat outposts, staffed by a handful of soldiers for months at a time, sanitation was a problem you solved as creatively as you could with the materials available. Soldiers in those environments developed an appreciation for planning that extended to every aspect of physical survival. When you know resupply is 10 days out and you have a certain amount of toilet paper, you do the mathematics quickly and with great seriousness. Rationing extends to things that civilians never consider rationing. Veterans of long patrol cycles in remote terrain describe a kind of deliberate physical management that becomes second nature over time. A constant background calculation of resources and needs that runs alongside the tactical thinking about routes, threats, and communication. Medical issues related to field sanitation have been a constant feature of American military history that official records tend to undercount, because the reporting mechanisms for intestinal illness have always been imprecise, and soldiers have a strong cultural incentive to not report conditions that might mark them as unable to perform their duties. A man who goes to the medic with a stomach complaint is off the line, and for many soldiers that is worse than whatever the stomach complaint happens to be. The culture of working through pain and illness has direct consequences for disease tracking, and military medicine has spent decades trying to correct for the underreporting that results from a service culture that treats physical complaint as weakness. The veterans who talk about this aspect of their service tend to do so with humor, which is the military's universal response to experiences that are simultaneously absurd and serious. The stories that get told at reunions and around kitchen tables are often the bathroom stories, the moments of maximum human vulnerability and maximum human danger, the times when the body's refusal to cooperate with tactical requirements produced situations that were, in retrospect, genuinely funny in a way that nothing else in war quite is. It is the laughter of people who have been stripped of every comfort and pretension and have discovered that what remains underneath, the basic human being with basic human needs, is actually more durable and more adaptable than anyone expected. The bathroom stories of American combat soldiers are, in their own strange way, a testament to exactly the same toughness and resilience that get celebrated in the more polished accounts of heroism and sacrifice. It is all the same person, in the same foxhole, under the same fire. And all of them, every single one, had to figure out at some point what to do when nature called in the middle of a firefight.